Kristen, oh my God, you're alive. Mrs. Fontaine grabbed both my hands at my cousin's baby shower, her face carrying genuine, overwhelming relief, as though she were looking at someone back from the dead rather than a 33-year-old woman who'd simply been living her ordinary life 2 towns over for the past 4 years. Of course I'm alive, I said, laughing uncertainly, confused by the sheer intensity of her reaction. Why would you think otherwise? Mrs. Fontaine's face shifted, something uncomfortable crossing it. Your mother told everyone you disappeared, sweetheart. 4 years ago. She said you cut off all contact, stopped answering calls, that nobody in the family knew if you were even safe. We've all been so worried. I stood there in my cousin's living room, holding a cup of punch, feeling the specific, disorienting shock of learning that for 4 years, my own parents had been telling our entire community I'd vanished, when the actual truth was considerably simpler, and considerably less dramatic. I'd simply stopped sending them money. My name is Kristen. I'm the oldest of 3 siblings, and for most of my 20s, I sent my parents a significant portion of my income every single month. Not an occasional gift, but a consistent, expected contribution that had started small, during a genuine rough patch when my father lost his job, and had gradually, over years, become a permanent, unquestioned fixture of my financial life. I want to be honest about how that arrangement developed, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how significant a boundary I eventually had to set. My father's job loss happened when I was 24, 2 years into my first real career position. I started sending $400 a month to help cover their mortgage during what I understood, at the time, to be a temporary crisis. My father found new work within 8 months. The $400 kept going, without any real conversation about whether it was still needed, gradually increasing over the following years to $600, then $800, framed always as simply what a good daughter did for her parents, regardless of whether the original emergency justifying it had long since resolved. By the time I turned 29, I was sending my parents nearly $1,000 a month, alongside covering significant portions of my younger siblings' expenses whenever they came up, a car repair for my brother, tuition assistance for my sister, an ever-expanding list of financial obligations that had, somewhere along the way, become simply expected of me, the responsible oldest child, regardless of my own financial goals or needs. I want to describe what that arrangement actually cost me, because I think it matters for understanding why I eventually needed to end it. I delayed buying my own home for years, unable to save adequately for a down payment while consistently sending such a significant portion of my income elsewhere. I put off a graduate degree I genuinely wanted to pursue, understanding I couldn't afford both the program and my ongoing family contributions. I watched friends my age building genuine financial independence, homes, investments, savings, while I remained, functionally, an unpaid financial safety net for a family that had long since moved past any genuine emergency. I finally sat down and did the full math at 29, 4 years before that baby shower conversation with Mrs. Fontaine, and understood, with real clarity, exactly how unsustainable this pattern had become, and exactly how little of my own actual future I was managing to build underneath it. I called my parents directly, carefully, having rehearsed the conversation many times before I finally worked up the courage to have it. I need to talk to you both about the money I send every month, I said. I love you, and I've been genuinely glad to help during the years it was actually needed, but I need to start pulling back significantly, so I can start building my own financial future, buying a home eventually, maybe going back to school. I can't keep doing this indefinitely. My mother's response was immediate and sharp. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Your father and I raised you. We gave you everything. Now that we actually need help, you want to just abandon us? I'm not abandoning you, I said, feeling the old, familiar guilt rising even as I tried to hold firm. I'm asking for a reasonable transition. I can still help occasionally, for real emergencies. I just can't continue an unlimited, permanent monthly contribution that's preventing me from building any financial stability of my own. We'll see how you feel, my mother said, her voice carrying a specific, cold finality, once you understand what it actually means to turn your back on your own family. I reduced my contributions gradually over the following 6 months, from nearly $1,000 monthly down to occasional, specific help during genuine emergencies, exactly as I proposed. My parents' response to that transition was colder than I'd anticipated. Fewer calls, shorter conversations, a specific, deliberate distance that I initially attributed to genuine hurt feelings, understandable if disappointing, given how significantly I'd changed the financial dynamic we'd operated under for years. I had no idea, during those months of gradually reduced contact, that my mother had already begun constructing an entirely different narrative for our extended family and community, one in which I hadn't simply set a reasonable financial boundary, but had vanished entirely, cut off all contact, abandoned my family without explanation or warning. I found out the full shape of that lie 4 years later, standing in my cousin's living room, holding a cup of punch, watching Mrs. Fontaine's relieved, tearful face slowly shift into something more complicated as she began to understand, in real time, that the story she believed for 4 years apparently bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. I want to describe the rest of that baby shower honestly, because the shock of Mrs. Fontaine's revelation was only the beginning. Once she'd said it out loud, other guests began drifting over, drawn by the specific, charged energy of a conversation clearly carrying more weight than ordinary small talk. "Kristen, is this true?" my Aunt Deborah asked, her face carrying the same confused relief as Mrs. Fontaine's. "Your mother's been telling everyone at church for years that you cut off the whole family. She cries about it sometimes, honestly. We've all felt terrible for her." I stood there, feeling the ground shift beneath 4 years of a narrative I hadn't even known existed, understanding, with growing clarity, exactly how thoroughly and deliberately my mother had constructed this story, and exactly how much genuine sympathy she'd apparently harvested from it. "I never disappeared," I said, my voice steadier than I expected given the specific, disorienting shock still washing over me. "I live 20 minutes from here. I have the same phone number I've had for 8 years. I reduced how much money I was sending my parents 4 years ago, and set a boundary about ongoing financial support. That's the entire story." The silence that followed carried a specific, heavy weight, several relatives exchanging glances that told me, clearly, this reduction was landing as genuinely new, significant information. I left that baby shower earlier than planned, driving home in a kind of stunned daze, trying to piece together exactly how extensive this false narrative had actually become. I called my cousin Rachel that evening, the host of the shower, someone I trusted to give me an honest, complete picture. "How long has everyone believed this?" I asked her directly. "The whole disappeared story?" "Honestly, Kristen, as long as I can remember," Rachel said, her voice carrying real discomfort. "I think it started maybe 4 years ago, right around when you mentioned cutting back on helping your parents financially. Your mom told everyone you'd basically vanished, stopped calling, stopped visiting, completely cut off contact. She's told that story so consistently, for so long, that I don't think anyone ever thought to question it. Did anyone ever try to reach out to me directly, during those 4 years?" I asked, genuinely needing to understand whether this was purely my mother's story, or whether it had actively prevented people from checking on me themselves. "I think a few people tried, early on," Rachel admitted. "But your mom always had an explanation, that you'd changed your number, that she didn't have current contact information for you anymore, that reaching out would probably just upset you further given whatever had apparently caused the falling out. I think, over time, people just accepted that as the reality, especially since your mom seemed so genuinely distressed about it." I spent the following week gathering evidence, methodically, the way I approach most difficult situations professionally, not out of a desire for dramatic confrontation, but because I needed, personally, to understand the complete, accurate shape of what had actually happened, separate from whatever story my mother had constructed. I pulled up 4 years of text message history with both my parents, showing consistent, if reduced, contact throughout the entire period. Birthday messages, holiday calls, the occasional visit, nothing resembling the complete severance my mother had apparently described to our entire community. I found call logs confirming regular contact, emails I'd sent checking in during the specific weeks my mother had apparently told relatives I'd gone dark. I want to be honest about what I felt, compiling this evidence. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that, but a specific, disorienting grief at understanding exactly how willing my mother had been to sacrifice my actual reputation, my standing within our entire extended community, simply to avoid the discomfort of explaining, honestly, that her adult daughter had reasonably decided to stop providing unlimited financial support. I called my father directly, needing to understand whether he'd been an active participant in the lie, or whether, as I half hoped, he'd simply gone along with my mother's narrative without fully understanding its actual scope. "Dad, I need to ask you something honestly," I said. "Did you know Mom's been telling everyone I disappeared, for the past 4 years? That I cut off all contact?" There was a long, uncomfortable pause. "I knew she'd told people we were going through a difficult period with you," he said carefully. "I didn't realize the specific extent of what she was actually saying, Kristen. I want you to believe that." "Dad, Aunt Deborah told me Mom's been crying about it at church." Mrs. Fontaine genuinely thought I might be dead. "That's not a vague, difficult period story. That's a specific, sustained lie, told consistently, for 4 years, to dozens of people." My father was quiet for a long moment. "I think I let myself not look too closely at what she was actually saying," he admitted finally. "I think some part of me understood it wasn't the complete truth, but it was easier not to examine that too carefully. I called my mother directly 2 days later, once I'd fully gathered the evidence I needed and given myself enough time to move past the initial shock into something calmer, more focused. "I need to ask you something directly, Mom," I said. "Have you been telling people, for the past 4 years, that I disappeared? That I cut off all contact with the family?" There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I understood, even before she spoke, that she wasn't going to offer an immediate, honest denial. "I might have said something like that, at some point," she said finally, her voice carrying a careful, defensive vagueness. "I don't remember the exact words I used. Mom, I have 4 years of consistent text messages between us. Birthday calls. Holiday visits. I have witnesses who say you specifically told them I'd cut off all contact, that you didn't know if I was safe. That's not a vague misunderstanding. That's a specific, detailed story you told, repeatedly, for years. You hurt this family, Kristen," my mother said, her voice sharpening now, defensiveness shifting into something closer to anger. "You cut off the financial support we'd relied on for years, with almost no warning. I had to explain that somehow, to people who kept asking why you weren't around as much anymore." "You could have told them the truth," I said. "That I set a reasonable financial boundary after years of supporting you both, well past the point of any actual emergency." That's a completely understandable, defensible thing to explain honestly. Instead, you told an entire community I'd vanished, let people believe I might genuinely be in danger, and let me become a source of tearful sympathy at your church for 4 straight years, all because the honest explanation was less flattering to you than the story you invented instead. "I don't see what the big deal is," my mother said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You're clearly fine. You're standing here talking to me right now. What does it matter what people believed for a few years? It matters because you destroyed my actual reputation, Mom, based entirely on a lie designed to protect your own image," I said, feeling something in me finally settle into a clarity I hadn't fully had access to during the initial shock. "People in our community have spent 4 years believing I abandoned my own family without explanation. That's not a small thing. That's years of people quietly judging me for something that never actually happened, while you collected sympathy for a fictional tragedy. So what do you want from me now?" my mother asked, her voice carrying genuine uncertainty for the first time in the conversation. "I want you to correct it," I said, directly, honestly, with the same people you told the original lie to. "I'm not asking you to grovel publicly, or to humiliate yourself. I'm asking you to tell the truth, finally, after 4 years of letting a lie define how people understand our relationship." My mother didn't agree immediately, and I want to be honest that the following weeks involved several more difficult, circular conversations before she finally, reluctantly, began correcting the story with specific relatives and community members. I decided, ultimately, not to wait entirely on her cooperation. I reached out directly to several key people myself: Mrs. Fontaine, my Aunt Deborah, a few longtime family friends who'd clearly been genuinely troubled by the fictional narrative for years, offering, calmly and without dramatics, the accurate, complete story. "I want you to know the truth," I told Mrs. Fontaine, during a call I made specifically to correct the record. "I never disappeared. I reduced financial support I'd been providing my parents for years, once it stopped making sense for my own financial future. I'd been reachable this entire time, the same phone number, the the same general area. I'm sorry you were led to believe something so much more alarming than what actually happened. I'm so relieved to hear that clearly, from you directly, Mrs. Fontaine said. I have to be honest, Kristen, I always found the story a little strange, the way your mother told it. I think some part of me sensed there might be more to it. I just didn't feel it was my place to push for details. I want to describe what happened within our broader community over the following month, as the accurate version of events gradually replaced the fictional one my mother had maintained for 4 years. It wasn't a single, dramatic public reckoning, more a slow, steady correction, one conversation at a time, as people who genuinely believed that it disappeared, story began understanding the actual, far more mundane truth underneath it. My mother's standing within our church community shifted noticeably during that period, several longtime friends privately expressing discomfort, to me directly, about the specific extent of what she'd apparently fabricated for years, at my expense. I don't think people are angry at you at all, sweetheart, Aunt Deborah told me, during a conversation about a month after the initial reveal. If anything, I think people are angry on your behalf, once they understood the actual shape of what happened. Your mother's going to have some real repair work to do, within this community, once everyone fully understands how long she let this go on. I want to describe the specific, difficult conversation I finally had with my mother about a month after the initial confrontation, once the truth had genuinely spread through our community and she could no longer maintain any version of the original story. I need you to understand what you actually cost me, I told her, sitting across from her at her kitchen table, the same table I'd eaten at throughout my entire childhood. For years, Mom. For years of people in our community believing I'd abandoned my own family, without explanation. For years of you collecting sympathy for a tragedy that never happened, while I had no idea any of it was even occurring. I know, she said, and for the first time since the whole situation had come to light, I heard something that sounded like genuine remorse rather than defensive justification. I think I got so caught up in managing how the reduced support made me look, to people whose opinions mattered to me, that I stopped thinking clearly about what the actual cost of that lie was, to you specifically. Why didn't you just tell people the truth from the beginning? I asked, genuinely needing to understand the reasoning, even 4 years later. Because the truth felt like admitting I'd raised a daughter who eventually said no to me, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I know how that sounds, now, saying it out loud. But at the time, telling people you'd simply set a reasonable boundary felt like admitting some kind of failure on my part, as though your independence reflected badly on me as a mother. The disappeared story let me be the victim instead, the sympathetic mother whose daughter had inexplicably vanished, rather than the mother whose adult daughter had simply, reasonably, stopped funding an arrangement that had stopped making sense. I sat with that explanation for a long moment, feeling a complicated mixture of continued anger and a kind of exhausted, clarifying understanding. I need you to actually see something clearly, Mom, I said. My independence was never a reflection of your failure as a parent. Setting a financial boundary, at 29, after years of supporting you both well past any genuine emergency, was a sign of healthy, responsible adulthood. The fact that you couldn't tolerate that story, that you needed to invent something more dramatic and sympathetic instead, tells me something important about how you've always measured your own worth through other people's approval, rather than through what's actually true. I think that's probably right, she admitted, quietly. I don't have a good defense for it, Kristen. I just have an explanation, which isn't the same thing. I want to be honest about where things actually stand with my parents, several months after the full truth finally surfaced within our community. My relationship with my mother remains genuinely strained, not severed entirely, but carrying a specific, ongoing wariness that I don't think will fully resolve for a long time, if ever. I've made clear, directly, that any future financial support will be occasional, specific, and entirely on my own terms, with no ambiguity or unspoken expectation attached to it. My relationship with my father has actually improved somewhat, oddly, through this whole difficult process. His willingness to admit he'd noticed the lie's extent and simply avoided examining it too closely, while not admirable, at least represented an honesty I hadn't previously experienced much of from either parent. I want to actually be different going forward, he told me, during a recent conversation, not just apologize for not stopping your mother sooner, but actually pay closer attention, going forward, to when something doesn't sit right, instead of letting it slide because addressing it feels uncomfortable. I want to describe, too, what happened with our broader community, because I think it represents the most significant, lasting outcome of this whole situation. My mother's standing within our church and social circle took a real, sustained hit, not from any dramatic public confrontation I orchestrated, but simply from the accumulated weight of people understanding, individually, how thoroughly and consistently she'd fabricated a story for her own benefit, at genuine cost to my reputation. I didn't seek that outcome deliberately, and I want to be honest that I feel genuinely complicated about it. Some part of me takes real satisfaction in watching the truth finally, fully surface, while another part of me feels the specific, uncomfortable weight of understanding my mother is now navigating real social consequences within a community she's been part of for decades. "You didn't do this to her," Rachel told me, during a conversation processing the whole situation together. "She did this to herself, Kristen, 4 years ago, when she chose a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth. You just finally told people what actually happened. The consequences of that are hers to sit with, not something you need to feel guilty about." It's been about 8 months now since that baby shower, and I've had real time to sit with everything that surfaced, and what it taught me about the specific, quiet danger of not knowing what story someone might be telling about you, entirely without your knowledge. I want to talk honestly about what this experience clarified for me. I spent years believing, on some level, that my mother's cold distance after I reduced my financial support was simply an understandable, if disappointing, emotional reaction to a difficult transition. I had no idea that distance was actually cover for an active, ongoing fabrication, designed specifically to protect her own image at my direct expense. If someone in your life goes cold after you set a reasonable boundary, I'd encourage you to stay curious about what that coldness might actually be masking, rather than assuming it simply hurt feelings working themselves out over time. I think this is the part of the story that still unsettles me most. Months later, for 4 years, an entire community held beliefs about me, judged me, felt sympathy or concern on my behalf, based on something that had nothing to do with reality, and I had absolutely no way of knowing it was happening. I'd encourage anyone watching this to consider checking in periodically with people in their broader community, not out of paranoia, but simply as a reasonable safeguard against exactly this kind of situation. I didn't storm into that community with some grand, theatrical reveal. I simply, calmly, told the truth to the specific people who'd been given the lie, one conversation at a time, with clear evidence available when needed. I think there's real power in that approach. The truth, presented calmly and consistently, tends to do its own work, without requiring performance or escalation from the person correcting it. My mother never fully articulated, even in her most honest moments, a version of events where inventing my disappearance felt like anything other than protecting herself. I think that's worth naming clearly. Choosing a story that makes you look sympathetic, at the direct cost of someone else's actual reputation, isn't a small, forgivable lapse. It's a genuine betrayal, regardless of how understandable the underlying insecurity driving it might be. I've made peace, slowly, with the real social consequences my mother experienced once the truth became known. I didn't orchestrate those consequences, and I don't think I need to protect her from them either. Sometimes the natural result of a lie finally surfacing is simply that people, understanding the truth, adjust how they regard the person who told it. That's not cruelty. That's just an honest, natural response to genuinely dishonest behavior. I still see my parents occasionally, careful, measured visits that carry little resemblance to the constant, financially entangled relationship we once had. I've built, instead, a genuinely full life on my own terms. The graduate degree I once put off, real savings finally accumulating, a sense of financial security I hadn't experienced in my entire adult life until I finally, firmly ended an arrangement that had stopped serving anyone well years before I found the courage to actually change it. I think about that baby shower often, still, Mrs. Fontaine's face, the specific, overwhelming relief of believing she was looking at someone back from the dead, and the slow, disorienting understanding that followed, piece by piece, of exactly how much had been quietly, deliberately hidden from me for 4 entire years. I'm grateful, in the end, that the truth found its way out, even if the path there wasn't one I ever could have anticipated. If you've ever found out someone was telling a version of your story that wasn't true, I want to hear it. Drop it below. And if stories like this one keep you coming back, You know where to find the next one.